Ahora tiene la palabra.
So, we've got a petitioner, Jane Golding, from British in Europe. She wasn't able to be here. Mrs. Kirton-Darling will read out her written statement.
Thanks very much. I'm making this statement on behalf of British in Europe, the 1.2 million UK nationals living in the EU 27, 80% of whom are of working age or younger, and the 3 million, the largest group representing EU citizens in the UK. It's hard to believe that the position of these EU citizens who have lived in uncertainty for more than 3 years now could be even less uncertain than it was last time that the two groups addressed this committee in January. With 30 days to go until the 31st of October, the UK is in the throes of a constitutional crisis, and there is no clarity that there will be a deal, or indeed what sort of a deal the UK government seeks. No deal is a disaster for British in Europe and the 3 million. 28 unilateral solutions for the 5 million citizens most directly affected by Brexit. In other words, a European postcode lottery with no clarity about coordinated issues like social security and healthcare and recognition of qualifications. We need to go back to the beginning and look at what was promised to these citizens in May 2017. Michel Barnier said in Florence, and I quote, "The level of protection afforded under EU law must not be watered down. Brexit should not alter the nature of people's daily lives." End of quote. The Essential Principles on Citizens' Rights in June 2017 said, and I quote again, "The withdrawal agreement should protect the rights of EU 27 citizens, UK nationals and their family members who at the date of entry into force of the withdrawal agreement have enjoyed rights relating to the free movement under union law, as well as rights which are in the process of being obtained and the rights, the enjoyment of which will intervene at a later date." End of quote. But in time, during the negotiations, this was watered down to the concept that citizens should be able to continue their lives broadly as before, and with protection limited to existing life choices. The 3 million and British in Europe pointed out many times, including in this place, that life choices are made on the basis of rights, not vice versa, and that it was rights that should be protected, not some sort of lifestyle choice. Now we've reached the point where if there's no deal, those rights deriving from EU law, which the EU said it would protect, would evaporate, and 5 million of the only 17 million citizens who fully exercise their free movement rights in the EU would simply default to third country nationals overnight, without any acknowledgement or protection of their former status, and without taking the principle of legitimate expectation into account. So the EU has several dilemmas. First, it has 5 million convinced Europeans who've exercised their EU citizenship rights, activated and owned them. In short, claimed them as individual rights. But the law has not moved with the reality of citizens owning their EU citizenship as an individual right, because EU citizenship is still dependent on the relationship between states and state membership of the Union. And then the EU needs to protect the integrity of the internal market and the 4 freedoms in the context of its negotiations with the UK. But what's the point of the European Union protecting that in the abstract if it doesn't protect the concrete exercise of the fundamental freedom of movement by citizens who are at its heart? Finally, the EU owes a duty of care to all its citizens, including British citizens in the EU 27. This is particularly important for the 3.6 million EU 27 citizens who may soon be living in a third country. Even if the EU settlement scheme in the UK were perfect, and the 3 million stress that it is not, EU 27 citizens in the UK need the protection of an international treaty. Without such protection, their rights are at risk of being sliced away over time, and this slicing is happening quietly, already, behind closed doors, using the UK's secondary legislation. Warm words from the British government and the Home Office are meaningless. Without an international treaty protecting the 3 million, their rights are certain to be diminished by this government. As for future British governments, this is an unknown. On the other hand, British citizens in the EU27 face 27 different solutions, their status dependent on where they happen to live, with no EU27 solution matching that offered by the UK to EU citizens. And for both groups, without an international treaty, important reciprocal issues such as pensions and healthcare, as well as recognition of qualifications, will simply not be covered. Neither will be clear adherence to the principles of non-discrimination or equal treatment, both covered in the citizens' rights part of the withdrawal agreement. We do not yet know what will happen before the 31st of October, but if an Article 50 extension is agreed, citizens need the EU to commit to ring fencing as soon as extension commences. The 3 million and British in Europe have often been told that ring fencing is only possible at the last moment, when it's really clear that no deal is possible. However, ring fencing is impossible at the last moment, as it would require both UK and EU agreement on it, ratification by the British and European Parliaments, and legislation implementing it to be passed in the UK Parliament before exit date. And it cannot be done outside the scope of Article 50 because issues of competence will arise and, more practically, ratification through 27 EU 27 parliaments plus potentially regional parliaments would be required. Instead, ring fencing must be agreed immediately once an extension is granted, so that the legal details can be worked out in relative calm and legislation can be implemented in plenty of time before we face yet another cliff edge. British in Europe and the 3 million are not asking for anything to be renegotiated, but we're asking that what's already agreed for both sets of citizens be saved rather than shredded. They call on you to recognise how urgently you need to protect 5 million of your most committed citizens. Their rights should never have been subjected to nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and they should never have been bargaining chips. They look to you to recognise the duty of care that the EU owes to its citizens, to these citizens. Don't let 5 million of only 17 million EU citizens who've used their free movement rights down, don't let them down in this unprecedented situation. Now is not the time to undermine the belief that some of the EU's most committed citizens have in the European project. I declare my interest. I have a Belgian husband, a Belgian-British child. These rights are my rights, and I stand with British in Europe and the 3 million to defend them. Thank you.